The warm wind swept the leaves through the mountains and meadows, filling everyone with good spirits, awakening a small and cozy town, and motivating everyone to get to work. This was also due to the loud hammer blow as someone drove the final nail into their construction project. The boy, who still had a few teeth left to count in his inventory, was immediately distracted, inspecting his creation with fresh eyes. He used to have a large public domain, and the boy was very interested in seeing if everything was finished or if he had forgotten something. Realizing everything was in order, the boy shed a tear of joy for completing such a grueling task. The ARCHMAGE Jason had just opened his own restaurant. His arms ached terribly, but it was worth it. Another dream had come true. However, 15 years ago, things had been very different. Back then, he would come home from school in the dark, longing to go to bed earlier. The boy dreamed of becoming a chef. He even enrolled in a special culinary institute. That day, Al wanted to practice his knife skills a bit more, but who would have guessed he'd stay up until dusk? The schoolboy was crossing the road, making plans to become an excellent cook and open his own restaurant. But at that very moment, 15 years ago, his plans abruptly changed. A truck with its headlights on barreled down the road, not stopping for anything or anyone. Al didn't react in time, or rather, he reacted too late and found himself facing death. That night, he thought his dream shattered into pieces, just like his body on the road after the accident. But for some reason, his body ached for a long time, and something started to burn within him. When he opened his eyes, his head throbbed, and he realized that after death, he had awakened in an unfamiliar world. The uniformed teenager stood up, trying to figure out where he was now. As he looked around, he discovered it was a fantasy world, and apparently at the wrong time. It was under invasion by people heading towards a fire-breathing dragon, armed with vessels and swords. The place was in complete chaos. Sweat trickled down his face, and his eyes reflected the terror he felt. Al was taken by surprise when another man touched him suddenly, scaring him. The man advised the boy to regroup because if he missed the evacuation, he would die here. Although the newcomer didn't fully grasp everything, he claimed he understood. People dressed in plain colors, carrying huge bags and backpacks, were moving in a column in one direction. Al asked where they were going, which made the man in front of him realize the boy was not from around there and seemed surprised by a native. He then explained that they were at the rear of the Rubber Empire. No one would have thought the Scarlet Dragons would come so far. At that moment, the boy didn't understand what was happening and didn't realize that the world he was in was full of monsters and magic. For the love of God, people adapt quickly, so Al tried to accept what was happening as soon as possible. The only option was to think positively about everything. He had almost been run over by a truck, so this was a second chance for him. Al tried to see the bright side in everything because, in his opinion, not everything was so bad. At least he wouldn't have to take exams, and the army wouldn't threaten him. At that moment, the newcomer to this world thought about his situation and hoped he wouldn't have to enlist in the army here. His attempt to process his new situation was interrupted by the sound of horses' hooves approaching from the horizon. A male voice from the mountain ordered everyone to pay attention for a moment. Everyone had to listen to the imperial decree, which was read in a severe tone, addressing the people of the Rubber Empire. The fate of the nation was at stake. The mercenary warriors had fled, and the knights had fallen in battle. The information that there was no escape from the dragons made the people visibly surprised and nervous, realizing the seriousness of the situation. But as soon as they heard the information, they realized they needed to stand up in defense of the country, and they began to shout their willingness to fight for their homeland. Only Al couldn't fully understand what was happening around him. Then the messenger loudly proclaimed that the emperor ordered them to fight to the death in the name of their lords and the Rubber Empire. Even amid the crowd's shouts, the boy began to understand that he had arrived in the middle of a war with dragons. The army was exhausted, and the empire depended on hired soldiers. Thinking about this made him shudder, realizing that his hopes for a peaceful life in another world had just become insignificant. The government imposed mandatory military service, and a bald man in an office asked the protagonist if he had any noble or knightly lineage. This question puzzled him, but the man explained that all men between the ages of 17 and 45, regardless of their origin, were automatically conscripted into the army of knights. Al, of course, was no exception, so he ended up in the barracks with a bunch of other new warriors, holding various things in his hands. Soon they were standing in a fenced yard, listening to one of the men shouting that the soldiers must salute the emperor. The warriors shouted, and Al quietly followed suit, thinking that it was better to die this way than under a truck. And so, a guy from our world became a knight in another. One day, a guy suddenly approached him, called out his number, and handed him a paper. Al had pretty good magical potential. After training, the boy would join the magical forces. After a tiring day for everyone, it was time for a good meal. A soup-like dish appeared on the plate, with with pieces of potatoes floating in it. Al took a spoonful of the dish to his mouth, contemplating that being a magician was far better than wielding a meaningless sword. It wasn't until a moment later that he fully tasted the flavors of his meal, especially the potatoes with octopus. The abomination made him shudder, while the men nearby commented on the same food, saying it wasn't so bad. Some even found the dish enjoyable, much to Al's horror. He couldn't believe someone thought it was not just edible, but actually tasty. When he saw a man nearby pouring the contents of his bowl into himself with enthusiasm, Al had a sudden thought. Maybe he could open his own restaurant here. The idea wouldn't leave his mind. He thought about it during training, while sleeping, eating, and in his free time. Perhaps his dream could come true after all. He trained hard, reminding himself that dragons were just beasts. Although they were difficult to manage, and his service wouldn't be required for another 2 years, he initially thought he only had to endure 2 years as a warrior of the Ruburn Empire. If he had known then that his service would last not just 3 or 4 years, but 15 years, he might have lost hope. He marched alongside the others, shouting that his bravery would even surpass the Barint River, ready to challenge the dragons. Who would have thought? Time flies, and here he was in the present, in the city of Grieg. A girl with a wicker bag on her shoulder passed by the restaurant and couldn't help but notice the huge new building in the clearing. She was curious, wondering if the store had been there before, as she didn't remember seeing it. Her thoughts were interrupted when a man appeared in her view. It was Al, who couldn't hold back his tears. The girl, seeing his emotional state, realized that he had probably been repressing his emotions for too long. Concerned, she decided to approach him and ask if everything was okay. Drying the salty tears from his face, Al replied that everything was fine and that he was just happy to have finally opened his restaurant. This surprised the young woman. She had no idea that the man in front of her owned such a large and beautiful building. They shook hands, and she introduced herself as Reina. Reina wondered how long Al and his business had been there, since she hadn't seen him around before. She then asked if Al was there alone, and he said no, mentioning he had company. Through the window, where sunlight streamed in, there was a room with a man dear to Al, but who loved to sleep a lot, so it was unlikely he would wake up before nightfall. There, sleeping, was a female figure with her hair wrapped around her pillow. Reina suddenly became excited and changed the subject back to the restaurant, mentioning she had a plan for a meat supplier and asked if Al needed one. Al, a bit embarrassed, admitted that he did need one and was planning to look for a butcher soon. This was great news for Reina, as her husband owned a butcher shop. She told him it was on the left side of the alley at the entrance to the town and was called Denon Butchery. Al was grateful for the valuable information and planned to go there right away. Reina then warned him that her husband could be temperamental, and if he got angry, Al should just tell him that Reina sent him. She smiled, sincerely grateful for the sweet girl's advice, wondering how such a kind soul could have such an irritable husband. But then, she realized she had encountered all sorts of people during her 15 years of service and thought she could handle it. Soon, Al was at the butcher shop. A muscular man with a scarred face and a small beard noticed the unexpected guest and asked threateningly what was happening. Al immediately felt intimidated, realizing he had already lost this battle without even fighting. He was overwhelmed by the man's temperament and character, feeling goosebumps all over his body. Ashamed and trembling, he stuttered as he explained that he had just opened his own restaurant nearby and wanted to discuss a potential partnership with the butcher shop, but was immediately rejected. The man told him he didn't sell meat to just anyone, especially not to restaurants, recalling a previous experience where people under the guise of a reputable establishment bought fresh meat only to sell it later at triple the price. Al was shocked, and Reina's husband sharply asked if Al was deaf, not understanding that he didn't sell his products like that. The butcher had been deceived before, and although Al tried to explain that he wasn't like those people, the butcher cut him off abruptly, still bitter from being tricked for 3 years. To him, Al was no better than those other customers, no matter where he came from. Suddenly, a very angry female voice interrupted, surprised by the man's comments, followed by the loud sound of a frying pan hitting the butcher's large head. It was Reina, who had a gut feeling that something like this might happen, so she had come to check on things. She immediately apologized to Al, asked him about his need for meat, and was willing to close the contract, while her husband sat there with a bump on his head, trying to justify himself by saying he hadn't lost his temper but was just reminded of the difficulties he'd faced with customers like that in the past. It was clear that Al, the new restaurant owner, didn't want to witness a family quarrel and wanted to leave quickly, far from such incidents. But there was no easy escape, so the arguments soon died down, and Reina sent her husband to fetch the meat. He obediently went into the back room. Reina removed her headscarf and, with a more serious expression, apologized to Al for the second time, explaining that she had worked in a restaurant for a long time as a hired hand and couldn't forget the injustices done to her. Al was quite surprised that Reina had also served in the army, and she pointed out that he seemed quite young to be a night. He couldn't believe he had already been recruited. Reflecting on the past 15 years, he commented that those experiences were unforgettable. Meanwhile, the girl's husband brought out the meat and placed it in a bag on the table, waiting for his visitor to demonstrate his skills. But the restaurant owner was a bit stunned by the meat he had been given. Of course, the butcher wasn't about to hand over a magnificent piece of Belle Lorenz. This joke made Reina seethe with rage, as though she was ready to burn everything around her. The reason for this was simple. Her husband knew that good meat would complement any dish, and he only provided such quality products to restaurants he trusted. When he let his nerves slip, he didn't expect such a reaction. The butcher's demand was clear. The young cook had to make a decent dish with this meat. If the butcher didn't like it, Al could forget about getting good products. Just as the pan was about to collide with his head, the butcher warned that Al should be prepared for high standards and the man's irritability. Understandably, this made Al nervous, but what made the situation even more uncomfortable was that he knew exactly what was coming next. In a split second, Reina's husband was lying unconscious on the table, drooling after his head met the pan. This reaction from his wife worried Al. He thought she might have overdone it, but she didn't seem to care much, adding that Al shouldn't take the butcher's words too seriously. She herself couldn't believe he had behaved like that, but didn't seem too offended. Al was determined to prepare a meal that would impress the demanding butcher. Reina was surprised when Al invited her and her husband to the restaurant that evening to try the food. She was equally surprised that he intended to cook with the meat they had provided, but declined his offer to bring Belle Lorenz, saying the meat they had was sufficient to make a tasty dish. With the bag from the butcher, Al left the shop, determined to prove himself. Reina seemed disappointed because the contents of the bag were mostly a slab of fatty meat. In this unusual world, animals had different names. For example, cows were called Yuga, chickens were Palenza, and Belle Lorenz, which her new acquaintance had offered, was actually wolf meat. Back at his restaurant, Al eagerly opened the bag. Full of enthusiasm, he began to prepare the fatty slab. His guests would be arriving soon. In this world, what they called pork was actually another type of meat. That's why Reina was so concerned about Al's success in the kitchen due to the high fat content. But even so, looking at the piece, Al understood why Mr. Creston was so proud. It was really a wonderful cut, perhaps the best he had ever seen. Palenza, unlike regular chicken, was a very expensive ingredient, and the cheapest meat here was grape, or what we would call pork. The cheapest part was the belly, which Al found odd. He didn't quite understand why he felt so uneasy. He quickly extinguished the fireball he had conjured in his hand, using it to light the oven. Magic, it turned out, was quite useful even at home. By the time the sun had set on the horizon, Reina and her husband were on their way to Al's restaurant. Reina asked her husband why he claimed he would only deliver good meat to trusted restaurants, as she didn't remember him having such principles. She wasn't accusing him of anything terrible. Reina knew he was a kind and honorable man, but his treatment of the newcomer had been inhospitable, and Mr. Creston only expressed his frustration that his wife had placed so much trust in a man she had just met. This sparked another wave of emotions in Reina. If her husband thought he knew people better than she did, especially considering how often he was deceived, she made it clear that she only wanted to see Al's culinary skills. He seemed to want to test Al's responsibility, which hurt the man who sighed and lowered his eyes, but then got angry and shouted at his wife, asking what he was supposed to do if Al turned out to be a terrible cook. She responded with the same question, and he reluctantly agreed to give Al only half of what Reina had asked for. Meanwhile, in a battle far from the restaurant, a monstrous creature with pointed ears and huge fangs was attacking its victim, hitting the man in the stomach with a large claw, causing him to spit blood. The monsters were tearing the army apart. There were too many of them, forcing the knights to retreat to save their lives. One of the knights, trapped with his foot stuck under a rock, was sobbing and begging for help, but no one could reach him. Terror gripped every fiber of his being as the monster raised a powerful weapon against him. Suddenly, a blue light illuminated the area, and a calm male voice began casting a spell, Sorrow Blade. Immediately, each opponent was enveloped in a bright light, blinding them. When they finally realized what was happening, it was too late. Massive cobblestones were flying towards them at an incredible speed. The knight who had been begging for help moments ago was absolutely terrified by the scene, but began to calm down. The warriors looked towards the man who had solved the problem so quickly, grateful to have the assistance of Lord Ilisun himself. Lord Ilisun, the great wizard, had come to save the men, giving them a new breath of fresh air after being on the brink of losing their comrades. Back at the restaurant, Al had finally finished cooking and was drying his hands with a towel when suddenly the door opened and the doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of new guests. Reina was the first to enter, greeting Al with a kind and warm smile. Al invited them to sit at any table and promised to bring out the dish right away. It was clear that the girl loved this place. It felt very cozy to her. However, her husband was just muttering that everything was just for show. His wife immediately took out a pan, her main weapon, and told him to stop criticizing everything he saw because they had to wait to eat. While the dish was cooking on a slow fire, Al prepared the frying surface by heating it and adding oil. There was enough fat in the belly of the meat to fry it without sticking. First, the crust needed to be fried, but as the meat began to cook from the inside, the crust would curl, making it harder to fry the meat evenly. Al thought it would be a good idea to give the moisture time to evaporate. Yes, he rotated the meat in the hot oil. The delicious aroma filled the air, making it smell incredibly appetizing. The crust was getting crispy. He continued frying the meat evenly on both sides, seasoning it with salt and other spices. Once the meat was well cooked inside, he sliced it into bite-sized pieces, ensuring each portion was of the same size. Next, he diversified the dish with a salad, carefully slicing the vegetables. While chopping the onions, he thought about using different ingredients and adding a spicy sauce to enhance the juiciness of the meat. However, he realized that such a combination might be unfamiliar to the people here. When adding the dressing to the salad, Al considered that Mr. Creston was very particular, and it was better not to take unnecessary risks. The final step was to arrange the dish on a plate in an appealing way, making it look even more appetizing. Everything was ready to serve the meat salad. As he placed the dish on the table, a feminine voice expressed admiration for the sight and the aroma wafting through the air. Reina sat there, nearly trembling with anticipation, while her husband begrudgingly admitted that the food looked impressive. The couple carefully speared a piece with their forks and brought it to their lips. Reina chewed the meat thoroughly, savoring the taste. An image of meadows with pigs running through them popped into her head, confirming that the dish was incredibly delicious. She couldn't believe it was actually made from abdominal fat, and that was the highest compliment for Al. The perfect combination of crispy on the outside and juicy on the inside, paired with a fresh and tasty salad, was ideal for cleansing the palate. Al felt incredibly happy when Reina said she had really enjoyed it. Learning that his restaurant would now be supplied with meat made him even happier. He then decided to ask Mr. Creston directly how he liked the dish. Creston, for his part, sat silently, a bit shaken by the realization that he had somehow been outdone by the young cook. The plate in front of him was completely empty. Then, with a groan of reluctance, the butcher initially refused to supply the meat, claiming they had none left. He immediately slammed his fist on the table, angrily declaring that he didn't like anything. But as Mr. Creston continued to demand more, stating that he couldn't wait any longer, an iron pan came crashing down on his head. As usual, it was Reina who insisted on a sincere opinion from her husband. Realizing how difficult it was to retract his earlier words, Creston finally admitted that this was the best dish he had ever tasted. So the deal was sealed. The sun had to shine, and Mr. Creston promised to supply Al with the best meat in the Ruburn Empire. Reina sat back, satisfied, commenting that her husband didn't need to make such a fuss. He would have admitted it anyway. The chef and restaurant owner was pleased with this turn of events. The men sealed the agreement with a firm handshake. Each was happy to work together, and finally Al had found a good butcher. Mr. Creston demanded more of this delicious meat as soon as possible, which led to an immediate request. The first day could be considered a success, without any major hitches. Meanwhile, the sun's rays were becoming stronger, slipping under the eyelids of the person lying in the bed upstairs, playing with dark hair. The girl, with her black hair tied up, got up, trying to recover after such a long sleep. By nightfall, there were fewer visitors, but the requests kept coming, and even the not-so-good belly meat was now tasty to them. Al sweated as he delivered orders, spreading a delicious aroma throughout the room, but he enjoyed it. There wasn't a single dish left. Everything was sold out, leaving everyone satisfied. The visitors left, grateful to the restaurant owner, acknowledging that the Belloran meat here was probably one of the most delicious they had ever tasted. Al treated each guest as special, chatting and maintaining a warm atmosphere. When things finally calmed down, he decided it was time to start cleaning up little by little. As he looked at the jars of condiments and spices, he noticed that they were nearly empty, which was a problem. Everyone knows how important they are in the kitchen. Thinking more carefully, Al realized he had run out of pepper and some other spices. Unfortunately, spices were very precious here, so they couldn't be used carelessly. In terms of quality, they didn't compare to the spices of the modern world. Al took a coin out of his pocket. It was time to restock. He placed the coin in the center of a magic circle drawn with different symbols and recited several spells. He summoned a lot of energy, which illuminated everything around him with a blue light. The restaurant owner had found a solution to the problem of spices and condiments. When he opened his eyes, they shone white. Blue smoke curled up to the table, and the silhouettes of some bottles began to appear. When the light faded, the table was already body covered with various liquids and packets that seemed perfectly normal to the human eye. After using otherworldly summoning magic, Al took a deep breath, remembering how difficult it had been to develop this magic. It had happened by accident while he was trying to return to his world. Any magic can be useful if used correctly. There are size and weight limitations, but this technique is incredibly handy. However, this method isn't the best solution, as he had never managed to return to his world, and for the objects he summoned, he had to send a couple of gold pieces. Unfortunately, raw meat, eggs, and vegetables would spoil during the summoning, and even prepared foods had limited shelf life, so this wasn't the only problem. The exact cause wasn't clear. Suddenly, he felt a heaviness in his body, and it became hard for him to breathe. His vision darkened. When he looked at the shelf, he was shocked to see that the containers were empty and crumpled. He couldn't figure out where all his beer had gone. Then, realization hit him, followed by anger. It all became clear in his mind. Lurene was the culprit, lying happily in bed surrounded by empty beer cans. She seemed to have done exactly as she pleased. Immediately, a bump formed on her head from a blow. A slight pain coursed through her body. She didn't understand why, so she asked what she had done wrong since she had been having fun with Al. The guy was angry and scolded her for drinking all the beer and not even bothering to cover her tracks or clean up. Lurene, on the other hand, argued that it was Al's fault for leaving her without any snacks. When she woke up and came downstairs, all that awaited her were empty plates. She was very upset that he had eaten without her. Lurene, proclaiming herself as a black dragon, argued vehemently. She insisted that cleaning was a job for servants, and she wasn't going to do such a thing, which infuriated Al even more. After this mischief, Al left her with another bump on her head, his patience wearing thin. He punished her by making her peel onions, despite her crying and reminding herself that she was a dragon and shouldn't be doing such things. It was the truth. She was indeed a dragon, though in human form. When Al met her during the Dragon War, she had lost her mother and her lair. Al couldn't bear to see her crying for her mother, so he couldn't leave her alone and took her in, caring for her ever since. Though she had lived for hundreds of years as a dragon, she was still quite young. As she moaned, the onion vapors stung her eyes. Then Lurene realized that if she stopped peeling the vegetables, she could get the fillet promised by the wizard for dinner. Al tried to lighten the mood and make her stop frowning. Suddenly, Al heard the door of his restaurant open. Surprised, he looked toward the entrance. It was Mr. Creston. The butcher looked downcast, as if he were about to cry. The man asked Al to serve him something strong in a glass. Al told him to wait a moment and check the fridge. Lurene had tried to drink everything, so he faced the new challenge of figuring out what to serve the visitor. After some thought, he grabbed a green bottle, thinking it would be a good idea to serve that. He was fortunate to have saved a bottle of alcohol from before, and now he just had to transfer it to another container. Al placed the meat and a bottle of clear liquid on the table, announcing that the food was ready. Creston was surprised by the drink, as it looked like water. He asked if it was really alcohol, to which Al replied that he should try it. It was quite tasty. Pouring the contents into a shot glass, Al explained that it was soju. Creston brought the glass to his nose, noticing that it had a strange smell. However, trusting the restaurant owner, he decided to take a sip, letting the alcohol flow into his system. Then he pierced the appetizer meat with his fork. The dish was tender and juicy. After taking a bite, he savored the flavors, chewing thoroughly before closing his eyes. As he enjoyed the taste, his left eye, which bore a scar, showed his true pleasure. Al was thrilled when Mr. Creston declared, without hesitation and with no fuss, that the food was delicious. In his opinion, it had a slight bitterness at first, but then sweet notes emerged, and the drink paired perfectly with the meat. The alcohol completely transformed the flavor of the dish. Creston found it incredible, quickly downing another shot. With the same downcast look he had when he entered, the butcher once again praised Al for his culinary skills. Then he asked the cook to bring him another bottle of this wonderful drink. Al didn't quite understand what was going on, but he couldn't refuse. After a while, several bottles were emptied and all the meat was gone. But Creston didn't stop. He slammed a full shot glass onto the table and ordered another bottle. The man was getting a bit carried away. Al tried to dissuade him, saying that he had drunk enough and that the drink was too strong, but the visitor was determined to keep going, insisting that he had to get drunk tonight. This declaration greatly surprised Al. He didn't understand why Creston was so adamant, so he asked, without considering whether it was appropriate to pry. It was clear that his guest needed to talk. Mr. Creston immediately became even more saddened, revealing that everything was a ruse. He then confessed, much to Al's shock, that he suspected his wife of having an affair. She had mentioned a few times that she needed to get away, but now it was happening all the time. Every month she would disguise herself. This had been going on for months. Creston decided to follow her, and what he discovered was simply simply horrible. His wife was secretly meeting with her battle partner, who was also Creston's closest friend. After the butcher shop opened, they hadn't seen each other again, and now it was clear why. It must have been too embarrassing for the old partner to look him in the eye. All this time, it was hard to believe. Mr. Creston had been worried about Reina. He was trembling because his wife had left again. He was anxious to know if he still loved her, and something deep down told him that the answer was no. Al tried to calm the man, who had completely succumbed to the storm of pain, explaining that another bottle wouldn't help improve the situation. But the butcher didn't listen. He didn't know how to cope with it all. What made it even worse, he said sarcastically, was that he still loved her sincerely and, despite everything, couldn't be without his wife. The restaurant owner listened in silence, not knowing what to say or how to comfort him. He wasn't sure what advice to give in a situation like this, but he quickly decided to take action. Al wanted to help the distraught and now quite drunk visitor, who looked at him with eyes devoid of hope. Al didn't want to believe that Reina was that kind of person. It had been a long time since they'd seen each other, but he still asked Creston to wait a little. The cook had to step out. Meanwhile, Lurene was still being punished for peeling onions. Her eyes were red and stinging from the tears, and she cursed Al with every layer of onion skin she peeled. Suddenly, the Archmage appeared and ordered the dragon in human form to finish up and come with him. When the girl asked what the problem was, she didn't get a clear answer and was immediately given an ultimatum. If she didn't want to be left behind, she had to follow him without asking unnecessary questions. It was a lively night in the city. Lanterns with a warm glow illuminated every corner of the streets. The residents were chatting cheerfully with one another, having fun and going about their business. Some dined in expensive restaurants, flaunting their aristocracy and manners at the table. Lurene was sitting on a rooftop watching all the diners. There were far more of them than in Al's restaurant, which annoyed her a little. She scanned the area, looking for Reina, and then spotted a woman who seemed out of place, sitting at a table in one of the establishments, clearly with someone. The sight made Al tense. He recognized Reina and the man sitting next to her. Could this bearded man be Lord Creston's battle companion? Al decided to ask Lurene for help, pointing out the man and woman at the restaurant table, and asked her to eavesdrop on their conversation. But Lurene wasn't going to do it for nothing. She wanted a fillet in return. Al promised her not just one, but two, so she would do it well. Lurene closed her eyes and tuned in to the right frequency and distance. She heard Reina's trembling voice as she spoke about feeling the need to tell her husband everything. She was speaking to Mant, Creston's former classmate. Reina expressed that she believed her butcher husband was starting to suspect them, and that she was also saddened that her lifelong friend no longer visited her shop. Lurene relayed Mant's words, which conveyed that if Reina's husband found out about his involvement, he would treat him even worse. Lurene was confident that she had repeated the dialogue accurately, without missing a word, giving Al much to think about. This didn't seem like a business meeting at all, but Al didn't need to know more. He immediately jumped off the roof, ordering Lurene to follow. At that moment, Al confirmed that Mr. Creston's suspicions were indeed justified. Reina was incredibly surprised by the sudden appearance of such a familiar face. She hadn't expected anyone to be there to overhear their conversation. Meanwhile, the butcher was lying on a table at the Archmage's restaurant, his head spinning from the alcohol, with only thoughts of Reina in his mind. Suddenly, the doorbell rang faintly as someone entered the restaurant. Creston looked up and was surprised to see who was standing there. It was Mant and Reina, both looking clearly worried and even a little scared. Mant was nervous as well. He could only manage a weak greeting, commenting on how he and his old friend hadn't seen each other in a while. Anger and jealousy surged through Creston's bloodstream, clouding his mind. Reina tried desperately to explain, claiming that Mant had misunderstood the situation completely and that it wasn't what it seemed. But her words were unconvincing. Creston's fist clenched even tighter. It troubled Reina to realize that Mant's confidence in her husband had now completely evaporated, even though it had once been strong. Without a word, Creston swung his fist at his old friend. He had no desire to resolve things peacefully, only to inflict harm and pain. Mant closed his eyes, bracing himself for the blow, even though he didn't deserve it. But for some reason, he didn't defend himself. Suddenly, Creston's hand was stopped by a sharp impact against a magic barrier, creating only a ripple of light on its surface. Mant was sweating from nerves, but he couldn't help feeling a sense of relief at this unexpected turn of events. It was hard to believe something like this could happen. Reina stepped back, astonished by what she had just witnessed. Magic wasn't commonly displayed so openly, judging by her reaction. It was as if fate had intervened. Al stood there with a satisfied smile on his face, explaining that aggression wouldn't solve anything and that it needed to be eradicated. Al tried to calm the situation by telling Creston that Mant had only asked for a loan to open a butcher shop. This revelation surprised the enraged man, who suspected his wife of cheating on him. Without reacting to Creston's surprised tone or questioning the information, Al quietly went about his business, bringing the purchased items to the table. He then invited everyone to sit down and have a civilized conversation while he prepared the food. Since Creston had been drinking all day, Al prepared a soup to aid digestion. At that moment, Reina brought some special Belloran meat, which was as good as any other for a dinner like this. The dish he prepared was siabu siabu, the Japanese version of shabu shabu, which was ideal for the occasion. The dish included thin slices of meat and vegetables served with a sauce. Al prepared a soy-based sauce, and once the broth was ready, he washed the anchovies and placed them in the pot. As the food cooked, its wonderful aroma filled the air, heightening the anticipation and making everyone eager to savor and enjoy this culinary art. The dish was served, and Al hoped it would clear up any misunderstandings. Creston, however, couldn't calm his mind. He found it hard to believe that Mant had really lent them money. The thought weighed heavily on him. Reina, with a guilty look and a deep sigh, explained that Mr. Mant had given them most of his savings, now that the shop was starting to bring in steady income. She had been seeing Mant to repay him. Mant listened in silence, realizing it had been a mistake to keep this from his friend. Creston felt even more hurt that the money had been given after they had caught the smuggler. It was hard to believe it was all true, but Mant decided to offer his friend some grace, knowing that Creston wouldn't have accepted the money if he had known the truth. Mant then apologized for not being there to congratulate him on the store's opening. He felt trapped, knowing that if the truth came out, he would be seen as a liar. Creston, for his part, asked what Mant's plans were after retirement and how he could have given away so much money. Just then, Al interrupted the conversation by serving the food, apologizing for the delay as the vegetables took a long time to cook. He suggested they continue their discussion over the meal. Mant was amazed at how thinly the meat was sliced, and Al told him it was Belloran meat from Creston's shop. Al had cut it into thin slices because that meat was best served with soup. He immediately invited them to try it, noting how appetizing the food looked. Al poured the broth into a bowl, hoping it would ease the tension between the old friends. Mant speared the meat and vegetables with his fork, from which a flavorful broth dripped. He tasted it, chewing the contents thoroughly, and instantly felt the wonderful flavors of the dish. Judging by his reaction, he liked it a lot. Satisfied, Mant let out a sound of pleasure and slid the dish toward Creston, offering him some of the wonderful food. Creston hesitated but eventually tried it, sipping the broth and letting the steam warm his face. His eyes widened in amazement at the culinary masterpiece before him. Mant began reminiscing about their battles in Fern, memories flooding back as he recalled how Creston had once sacrificed himself to protect his friend by taking a sword blow to his body. Mant vividly remembered that day. The warriors had run out of supplies, and the battle had dragged on too long. All the fighters were exhausted, forced to eat only thin soup with little enjoyment just to gain some energy. Then, a young blonde man had caught a wild Belloran, battling and defeating it. Though he had only caught one beast, he collapsed from exhaustion, scaring Creston with his weakened state. The Belloran meat soup they made afterward was bland, and the tough meat was hard to chew. Yet even in this less-than-ideal state, the dish had been impressive. Lord Creston felt a chill as he recalled those memories, completely agreeing with his battle partner. Another hot and tasty serving of siabu siabu was placed before them, and Mant explained why he had helped his friend with the money. He remembered the nights spent around the campfire eating together, though the food back then wasn't nearly as good as what they were eating now. Mant decided to keep the secret that he didn't really have any future plans. When he admitted that all he wanted was to help Creston, tears welled up in his eyes and a chill ran down his spine. Salty tears fell onto his wrists as he gripped the small bowl of soup. Silently, he apologized to his friend for his suspicions and the thoughts he had harbored. Al stayed silent, not interfering in their reconciliation. A smile played on his face. He was happy that the conflict had been resolved and that he had been able to help the men come to an understanding. Mant took another sip of siabu siabu, the warm broth soothing not just his throat but his soul as well. By now, night had fallen. The moon was high, and the stars shone brightly, some even shooting across the sky, as if trying to capture this moment in the memory of the universe forever. Meanwhile, Lureen was already yelling at Al, reminding him that a dragon's promises must be kept, and accusing him of not taking her seriously. She was very angry, and Al rubbed his head guiltily, excusing himself by saying it was still night and that he would cook the fillets for her a little later. But Lureen corrected him with a scream, insisting that it was already night and demanding what was owed to her by contract, refusing to let him get away with such behavior. Suddenly, Mant, who had been talking with Al, intervened in the conversation. He asked if Lureen had enjoyed the food, to which she responded that she was delighted with the dinner. Mant then explained that the reason he was looking for Al was that he had a question. Al was surprised, not knowing what Mant could possibly want to ask. Mant revealed that the brigade had recently received orders to escort a person of high rank and wanted to celebrate with a dinner before they left. He wanted to host this dinner at Al's restaurant. This request left Al a bit stunned. He couldn't believe it and didn't know how to react. Al rushed out, trying to prepare everything as quickly as possible, sweat running down his face. He shouted to the people in front of him not to run away, but of course they didn't listen, and he wasn't about to stop them. Polenzas are monsters that resemble chickens, but they are treated very differently here because they periodically change habitats, making them difficult to capture. They are very fast, and their meat is considered rare and highly valued. Al was already regretting choosing this meat for the festive dinner, and even considered burning down the whole forest. Creston was surprised to learn about the existence of this meat, especially when he thought that if someone had found a way to catch and sell them, they would be swimming in gold. This reaction made it clear that Creston didn't have this meat in his shop. Al reminded him that the butcher had once claimed he could get any type of meat, hinting that Creston might have lost his confidence. This remark hurt Creston, who responded by rolling his eyes and mentioning that he had heard rumors that the Polenzas had recently been spotted in the lemon tree forest. That's how Al ended up in the forest hunting chicken-shaped monsters. Exhausted, he sat on the ground, breathing shakily, admitting his defeat and surrendering. He decided to leave the matter to Lureen, who agreed to help on the condition that Al would wash all the dishes himself. Without much thought, he agreed. Meanwhile, Lureen unleashed a burst of purple light, illuminating everything around her. She used her dragon's roar skill, her eyes turning pupil-less and emitting sparks. The powerful blast sent the bird-like creature flying, as if wrapped in blades. The hunt was over, and the Polenzas wouldn't escape this time. As Al celebrated their catch, Lureen teased him, saying he was lucky to have consumed the dragon's heart. Otherwise, he would have been killed. She continued to drink a cold beer, laughing at her small, yet significant, achievement. Lureen then remarked that there was nothing better than having a cold drink after a hard day's work, while Al commented that he was falling behind. The dragon became outraged, insisting that he shouldn't devalue everything. It wasn't easy to accomplish what they had. Her eyes began to burn with intensity, and to avoid further conflict, Al agreed, asking her not to drink too much so there would be something left for the guests. As the night continued, the aroma of perfectly marinated chicken filled the air. Smoke billowed from the stove chimney, and people were already seated inside the restaurant, chatting about how Mant had recommended the place. Many joked about not trusting him, but Mant assured his companions that they wouldn't regret it. Only Miltine, Mant's young companion, confidently said that he trusted the warrior and was sure the food would be delicious. A bald man at the table commented that the young man would probably find even the earth tasty. Sensing the need to stop arguing, they fell silent as the food arrived. Al approached the table and apologized for the noise, understanding it was a festive night. Mant introduced Miltine to Al, who immediately realized he had heard a lot about him. Mant had praised Al's restaurant many times. Al placed a tray of food on the table, expressing his hope that the guests would be satisfied. On the table sat a very appetizing baked chicken with a golden crust, shining as if it had been perfectly glazed. Miltine immediately recognized it as the legendary creature that even professional hunters couldn't catch. Al was surprised by his reaction and assured them that it wasn't that legendary. They should eat before it got cold. Mant was the first to take a bite of the incredibly appealing meat. For a moment, everyone paused, contemplating the pieces on their forks. A mysterious silence fell over the group, and then they began exclaiming how incredibly delicious it was. Mant was pleased that his promises had been fulfilled. Miltine, for his part, ate the food as if it were his last meal. The bald man warned him not to eat it all and to leave something for the others. Al, satisfied with the reaction, decided to serve the other tables as well. After serving the food, Al entered another room, asking Lureen for help because they had too many customers that night. Lureen, with a sly look, clarified that Al was asking a dragon to serve people. She reminded him that he had asked her, the one who caught the legendary creature that even the best hunters couldn't catch, to help out. Realizing she had eavesdropped on their earlier conversation, Al's voice turned cold as he told her that if she didn't want to help, she didn't have to, but she had forgotten something important. Lureen immediately became nervous, worried that she didn't understand what Al was thinking. He reminded her that they had opened this restaurant together at the end of the war. Al reminded Lureen that they had sworn to work hand in hand and support each other. Now, it seemed as if someone had changed their mind, breaking that promise. He subtly hinted at those past times with a touch of sadness. But if that was the case, Al suggested that Lureen could leave, and he would handle everything himself. The tactic worked. The dragon immediately jumped up and agreed to help, quickly changing her mind. It amused Al that Lureen tried to justify her sudden enthusiasm by saying it could actually be quite interesting to serve the guests. To lighten the mood, he even decided to invite her for a beer afterward. Meanwhile, the chicken meat sizzled in the oil, browning and releasing a mouth-watering aroma. As the oil bubbled, so did the life in the restaurant. The men drank alcohol, shouted, laughed, and joked, while Lureen moved between tables, serving dishes and fulfilling the customers' wishes. There was no time to think about fatigue. After some time, when all the visitors had left, Lureen slumped over a table and let out a heavy sigh of relief, glad that her ordeal was finally over and she could rest. As she rested, Al approached with a portion of meat and some cans of beer, leaving a few bites for them as well. Lureen deserved a treat and a compliment. She immediately pounced on the food, devouring each bite down to the bone without even trying to fully savor the incredible flavor. Even at this fast pace, the meal seemed delicious to her. As Al rejoiced at her positive reaction to his creation, he noticed how clean the surroundings were, even though he hadn't asked her to clean. Everything was spotless, as if it had been meticulously cared for. Had Lureen finally matured enough to know how to take care of the space she shared? Just then, the girl's head fell onto Al's shoulder, her hair cascading down. She did it deliberately, reminding him that this was their shared restaurant and that she also had a responsibility to care for it. Al was pleased by her words, realizing that she was in a good mood. He decided to test his luck and cheekily suggested they forget about the agreement that he would have to wash the dishes for a month. But Lureen quickly shut down that attempt, insisting it was an entirely different matter. At that moment, a dark silhouette appeared outside, leaving footprints in the grass with each step. Lureen immediately tensed, sensing the presence of a stranger. Her eyes widened in alarm, and she quickly hid behind Al. He was surprised by her reaction and wondered what had caused such fear. Suddenly, the door opened and a deep, intimidating voice spoke, expressing disgust at everything around him. Al recognized the voice and, equally surprised, realized who had come to see them. An old man, his face hidden beneath a hood, commented on how horrible human towns always were. It was clear that Al was not happy to see this person again. His voice turned cold and unfriendly, while Lureen continued to hide behind him, clearly terrified. The intruder was a black dragon, the old man of Meriden, a repulsive figure who took off his hood and sneered, muttering that humans were unworthy of uttering his name. Al, determined to protect Lureen, wanted to know why this not entirely human figure had appeared there. The old man started the conversation by sarcastically noting that Al and Lureen were doing quite well in such a humble place. But Al wasn't fooled. He knew exactly why this man was here. He had come for Lureen. From what Al knew, no one had opposed Lureen staying with him. Yet the visitor seemed to have come to discuss just that. The hoarse voice of the old man commented on Al's usual lack of decorum, but acknowledged that he was right. The old man had indeed come for Lureen. Lureen, now even more frightened, spoke in a trembling voice, insisting that she wanted to stay and that she didn't want to leave either this place or Al. She accused the old man of having abandoned her once before. The old man tried to explain to her that he had never intended to abandon her and that he had simply arrived too late. He also reminded her that her mother had committed a terrible sin. But before he could go on, Al cut him off, saying he was tired of the chatter. He reminded the old man of his promise, noting that dragons weren't known for breaking their word. A displeased smile appeared on the old man's face. He had come to discuss that very promise. It was true that they had agreed to entrust Lureen to Al, but as the old saying goes, the first word is stronger than the second, and Al, who stood protectively in front of Lureen, couldn't understand what was going on. In the Black Dragon clan, the age of 800 years is considered the threshold of adulthood. A private dragon, once it reaches 800 years, becomes a pupil and is sent to the Holy Lands. Lureen had lived in her mother's lair, but it had been destroyed. So next year, when Lureen turns 800, she will have to go to the Sacred Lands. Those are the clan's rules, and no one can break them. Al sighed heavily, saying he didn't see anything wrong with that, which greatly surprised the old man. He hadn't expected such a reaction. Dark energy began to swirl around the old man, his anger intensifying at Al's words and perceived disrespect. It seemed he wanted to destroy everything around him. Al, however, remained emotionless, fully aware that he had no choice in the matter. But Lureen, clearly more distressed, shouted at him to focus on what was happening. The old man bared his sharp fangs, his twisted smile revealing his disdain for Al, whom he saw as almost ordinary. The dragon had lost all patience, despite knowing that Al had consumed the heart of the Dragon Lord. Lureen, trying to keep the situation from escalating, shouted that everything was fine and that war was not an option. A look of frustration crossed Al's face, showing that there was a misunderstanding between him and the old man. Al quickly clarified that he was talking about building the dragon's lair, not starting a war. This seemed to calm the old man down, and his murderous intent towards the Archmage dissipated. Lurene also relaxed a little. They still had a whole year ahead of them, so they could build the lair safely within that time, maybe even start now. Al asked the dragon if this arrangement was satisfactory, and the old man agreed. He immediately opened the portal through which he had entered and promised to return in a year. Who would have thought that such a heated discussion would end so easily? After that, Al decided to build the dragon's lair, a cave where dragons live, adorned with magnificent interiors and dazzling treasures, symbolizing the lair's grandeur. Obviously, it would take a lot of time and resources to build. Meanwhile, the restaurant was bustling with customers who chatted, ordered food, and enjoyed their time there. Al was aware that even if they started now, they wouldn't have enough time to build the lair. Rumors had spread that Palenza was being served at the restaurant, so people flocked there. They didn't listen when Al explained it was a limited edition dish, and the restaurant descended into chaos. Lurene informed Al that one of the tables was ready to order, urging him to hurry, but he was already overwhelmed. His real enemy at that moment was the mountain of dirty dishes. The Archmage couldn't take it anymore. He decided to reduce the flow of guests, even though he had initially intended for the restaurant to be busy. Lord Creston looked on in amazement, his mouth agape. It wasn't clear what was happening. He noticed rare animals resembling chickens perched in the trees. Al explained that they were Palenza, to which Creston responded that he could see that, but he wondered why they were there. Al then revealed his plan. He would supply the butcher with Palenza meat, making Creston the owner of the only store that sold such elegant meat. But Creston had another question. How was Al going to hunt those creatures, which even the best hunters in Grieg couldn't capture? Al asked him not to worry, though Creston clearly hadn't heard about the craziness of serving that meat in the restaurant. Al proposed a contract, offering to supply the meat for free in exchange for half the profits. Of course, Creston thought it was too much, given that Al would be doing all the hunting and taking all the risks. But Al argued that it was fair, as he wouldn't be able to supply large quantities, so Creston wouldn't earn much anyway. He advised Creston to use the opportunity to sell other types of meat and suggested he buy his wife a new dress. This suggestion struck a chord with the butcher, and he agreed without much hesitation. While Al conjured his magic, Creston mentioned that he had heard the Palenza often changed habitats. Suddenly, a magic circle on the ground glowed with intense blue light, creating a dome-shaped barrier over a specific area of the forest. Al asked if that would be enough. Creston could only stare in amazement at the dome, realizing it was incredibly difficult for a novice in magic to create something like that. He began to wonder who this ordinary cook really was. Al then put a finger to his lips, signaling that Creston didn't need to know everything, murmuring that he was just a normal, retired cook like Creston himself. He added that he hoped his magic would remain a secret. The next day, Al's plan was carried out perfectly. The restaurant was clean, with no plates on the tables and no customers seated in the chairs. It was an unusual sight for a restaurant, and while it wasn't ideal for business, Al found it oddly satisfying. Lurene noticed this too, but didn't share Al's joy, feeling a bit uneasy about the lack of customers. Despite the quiet, there was a glimpse of hope. They now had enough time to build the lair. Remembering this, Lurene's mood brightened, and she asked if Al would live in the lair with her once it was finished. Al immediately replied that he intended to stay at the restaurant, which didn't please Lurene at all. In fact, it enraged her. She declared that if he wasn't going to live in the lair, then they didn't need to build it at all and might as well start a war with the dragons. Al quickly asked Lurene to calm down and proposed a compromise. They could build the lair nearby. Despite her worries, he reassured her and asked her to follow him. They walked outside and down the hill on which the restaurant stood, to a slope just below the establishment. Since the restaurant was on the outskirts, all the surrounding land belonged to Al, and he planned to build the lair nearby. Lurene seemed satisfied with this arrangement, although she noted they would have to keep an eye on the inner barrier to prevent any collapse during construction. Filled with enthusiasm, she was ready to start digging. However, Al turned around and headed back to the restaurant, wishing her good luck. He reminded her that the restaurant couldn't be left unattended after all their efforts. Lurene froze in place, shocked that Al would abandon her at a time like this. Edison was lying on a table in his cafe, basking in the sunlight and enjoying some free time he hadn't had in a long while. Suddenly, the sound of a door opening interrupted his peaceful rest, prompting him to look toward the entrance. A young boy with short blonde hair and blue eyes entered. He was dressed in expensive clothes and appeared quite nervous. With an uncertain voice, the boy asked if he was in the famous restaurant. Edison, unsure of what famous restaurant the boy was referring to and unaware of how popular his place had become, responded by saying that it was indeed a good place to eat, though he wasn't sure about the fame. The boy then explained that he had heard they served the legendary Palenza meat there. Edison, feeling a a bit discouraged by this request, informed the boy that they no longer served that dish and suggested he visit Creston's shop instead. The boy, however, said he couldn't follow Edison's advice and reluctantly agreed to eat something else because he was very hungry. Edison accepted his request and told him to sit down and wait. As the boy settled in, Edison used magic to think about his new visitor. The boy seemed to come from a wealthy family, but Edison knew he had to treat all customers equally. The only dish Edison thought a child might like was a hamburger, which was fortunate because it was a dish often made for Lurene. He prepared the patty using walnuts, shaped the minced meat, salted it lightly, and fried it in butter. Then he placed the patty on top of vegetables and poured a tasty garlic sauce over it, adding a final touch, a perfectly poached egg. Although Edison usually avoided poached eggs, he made an exception this time. When the dish was finally ready, it looked incredible, an artful creation that even a dragon couldn't resist. The boy, upon seeing the served plate, was overjoyed, but in his ignorance, he mistook the hamburger for a sandwich, which disgusted him. Edison quickly corrected him, explaining that it wasn't a sandwich. Despite his initial misunderstanding, the blonde boy decided to try the food. Just as he was about to take his first bite, people rushed into the restaurant. A tall, long-haired man approached the boy, addressing him as young gentleman. The blonde tensed up, a mixture of frustration and fear crossing his face. It seemed they had been searching for him while he was sitting in the restaurant. The boy began to justify himself, but the man who had come for him interrupted, warning him not to eat at the restaurant because he could be poisoned, and urged him to leave. The insinuation about the restaurant's low-quality products angered Edison. Though he didn't want to, he felt compelled to intervene. The gray-haired man turned to Edison, asking if he was the owner of the place. He seemed completely unaware of whom he was speaking to, as he remarked that the boy with his head down was the son of Lord Greg. Clenching his teeth, the Archmage explained that he didn't care about titles. He was just serving his guest. The man, angered by Edison's arrogance, confronted him, while the young boy tried to defuse the tension. The blonde then handed Edison a coin, apologizing for the trouble he had caused by making him cook and feeling guilty for not even tasting the food. With his head bowed, he left with the men who had come to retrieve him, clearly upset. A sense of unease began to grow within Edison, realizing that the situation had taken a hurtful turn. Suddenly, Lurene returned after digging her refuge. She was covered in dirt, almost in tears, and screamed that she couldn't continue digging because her hands were hurting too much. She became hysterical, frustrated that she couldn't do it all by herself. Edison calmed her down, saying that it was enough for today and that they would dig more tomorrow. For now, he ordered her to follow him. Lurene calmed down a bit and looked at Edison with tear-streaked, dirty cheeks, not understanding what was going on. She then added that she was hungry. Edison promised to cook something for her when they returned, hoping to earn some money in the process. The pair headed toward the luxurious and grand castle of Lord Greg. Duran Gregg was sitting at his desk in a large room, looking deflated and contemplating the situation. Suddenly, a bright blue door appeared near him, and Duran was shocked to see who stepped out of it: Edison and Lurene. The brown-haired man was holding a paper bag that he had obviously brought for the boy. While Edison attempted to hand over the food, Duran was still in a state of amazement, stunned by the magic that had just been used in front of him. Edison opened the bag, revealing the hamburger, and said that he couldn't leave without delivering what the boy had paid for. Duran, excited, took the food, discovering that it had been kept warm so that he could enjoy it properly. The smell of the hamburger made Duran's mouth water, and he fantasized about tasting it. Although he had many questions, his priority was the food. Just as he was about to take a bite, there was a knock on the door, and a voice called out to the young gentleman, asking if everything was all right. Duran froze, not expecting this turn of events, while Lurene remained unperturbed. Edison's expression shifted to one of irritation and disappointment. He had finally wanted to leave the boy in peace to enjoy his meal,